parade of WWE developmental projects has been hit or miss long before the middle of 2005, by which point the conveyor belt had perhaps been churning out more misses than hits. 3 years removed from striking gold with the OVW4, there appeared to be less stars of comparable stock headed down the same route. Then, late that summer, an intriguing prospect emerged from the mist, literally introducing himself to a curious audience with disdainful arrogance dripping from each syllable. This brash individual looked for all the world to be a can't miss, having all the makings of a future WWE champion. However, through the sort of bad luck reserved for the truly accursed, his enormous potential went to waste. I'm Jack from Cultaholic.com, and this is Remembering Mr. Kennedy's WWE Run. Even before signing a developmental deal with WWE, Ken Anderson was on the radar of a few major promotions. He wrestled a number of matches as an enhancement talent on WWE programming between 2001 and 2004, and even teamed with Shawn Daivari in a loss on TNA Explosion in early 2003. Apparently, TNA had at least a passing interest in Anderson as a regular talent at that point. He claimed years later that Jeff Jarrett proposed the idea of bringing him in as part of a stable of hired guns. But when Anderson called Jarrett back to talk more, Double J just never responded. Ultimately, in February 2005, WWE offered Anderson a formal developmental contract, upon which he reported to Ohio Valley Wrestling. As Anderson attests, he liked Booker Jim Cornette, but believes that Cornette didn't see that much potential in him. Cornette's stance is that he thought Anderson was a little bit green in his ring work and initially put him with the tag team the Blonde Bombers as a way for him to develop. The two didn't work together all that long, however, as Cornette was let go following a noted altercation with Santino Marella. He was then replaced by another veteran booker, Paul Heyman, and that is when the stars aligned for Anderson. Heyman saw immense potential in him, and following a few promo classes, Heyman reportedly even went so far as to tell Anderson he had the same magnetic spark that Steve Austin and The Rock possessed, and promised to help him reach his potential. Heyman encouraged Anderson to amplify his voice more and came up with the idea of cutting off the ring announcer in order to introduce himself. To heighten his unchecked bombast, Anderson began saying his surname twice in the introductions, something he'd done as a joke while announcing basketball games in high school. Throughout July, Heyman built Anderson up as the next top heel in OVW, going so far as to have him defeat Matt Cappotelli to become #1 contender for the heavyweight title. A week and a half later, still using the Anderson surname, the brash youngster wrestled his first WWE match as a contract star, defeating Funaki in a matter of minutes on the weekend show Velocity. According to Anderson, he was initially being brought in to lose to Funaki via a roll-up, but he managed to change his fortunes. He was prompted backstage by longtime agent Steve Lombardi, the Brooklyn Brawler, to explain in promo form why he had what it took to be the next big star. Following what one imagines to be your typical high-volume Anderson sermon, an impressed Lombardi passed along word of his oratory skills to Vince McMahon, and not long after, Anderson learned that the finish was changed to him winning. A week later, Anderson went over on a local enhancement talent while continuing to hone his loud and proud self-glorification, sanding the edges of the boom and bluster that were to be his hallmarks. It was for this match that Anderson became Ken Kennedy, or just Mr. Kennedy, which was a nod to McMahon's middle name. Reportedly, it was Heyman that suggested this particular ring name as a way to endear himself further to Vince. The fact that Anderson owned tights with a double K logo because of his old indie name Kamikaze Ken only aided in the change. Augmenting his character was a special prop, a suspended microphone that would lower to him from the ceiling upon his gesture in order for him to deliver his personalized self-intro. The now renamed Kennedy got the quintessential beginner's push, where he built up a winning streak against mid-carders such as Paul London, Scotty 2 Hotty, and Hardcore Holly, while also defeating genuine main event stars in Booker T and Rey Mysterio. If he lost, it was generally via DQ. Such was the case in a rather infamous defeat to Eddie Guerrero in what sadly turned out to be Guerrero's final match before his death just days later. The following week, Kennedy experienced his first major setback in WWE. While competing in a 10-man tag on a tour of Europe, he was dropkicked off the ring apron by Paul London and landed hard on the outside. The pain was initially diagnosed as a muscle bruise, and Kennedy continued to wrestle. But he had an MRI not long after returning to the States, and there the news was more disheartening. Kennedy's lat muscle had been torn completely off the bone, and the injury injury sidelined him for close to 6 months. Suddenly, one of WWE's hottest characters had been wiped from the weekly programs. No Royal Rumble match appearance, no showcase at WrestleMania 22 in Chicago. And you have to imagine that in Chicago, a citizen of Green Bay, Wisconsin could really have taken an unrepentant swipe at the crowd given the NFL rivalry. Instead, Kennedy popped back up on WWE TV in the late spring, in a sense returning to square one with a series of quick wins over the blue brand cellar dwellers. Kennedy's first pay-per-view match in 9 months came at the 2006 Great American Bash, albeit as a substitute for the injured Mark Henry. But substitution or not, he got to work with a top guy in Batista, which demonstrated residual faith in the upstart. The fact that Kennedy won by DQ instead of, say, being devoured in 3 bites by the animal attests to this fact. 6 weeks later, Kennedy struck gold in WWE, defeating US champion Finlay in a triple threat match that also included Bobby Lashley. The reign only lasted 6 weeks in all before Kennedy dropped the belt to a returning Chris Benoit on an episode of SmackDown. And little did anyone realize that this would be Kennedy's only title reign of any sort in WWE. Dropping the US title was hardly a burial though, as Kennedy moved on to the sort of thing that would give Theodore Long the most joyful sort of butterflies, a one-on-one feud with The Undertaker. Kennedy prevailed in a first blood match with the Dead Man at Survivor Series before going out in defeat in a last ride bout at Armageddon the next month. Come January, Kennedy got a crack at the World Heavyweight title, losing to Batista at the Royal Rumble. Losing 2 consecutive pay-per-view bouts to giants the caliber of Undertaker and Batista is hardly a career killer, and in fact, Kennedy was being groomed for the Friday Night Throne. At WrestleMania 23 in Detroit, Kennedy outlasted 7 other men to pull down the Money in the Bank briefcase. Edge and RVD before him had made good on the entitlement therein, and it was inevitable that Kennedy before long was going to be announcing himself as World Heavyweight Champion. Except that didn't happen. There was a target date for Kennedy to cash in his briefcase, the SmackDown that would be taped on Tuesday, May 8th, 2007 and air 3 nights later. The Undertaker was World Heavyweight Champion and needed surgery, so Kennedy was going to jump him following a title defense against Batista inside a steel cage. There, Kennedy would send Undertaker off TV with a loss and assume the mantle of SmackDown's Golden Kingpin. Unfortunately, just days before the biggest moment of Kennedy's career would come to pass, the top heel sustained another injury, this time while working with Batista in a tag team match at a house show. Diagnosed with a torn tricep, Kennedy was flown to Monday Night Raw to lose the briefcase to Edge in a matter of seconds in a truly random match. Edge went on to fill Kennedy's shoes in the SmackDown plan and capture the title in the fallen Kennedy's place. To be fair, Kennedy has questioned why he had to lose the briefcase there and then, because the injury required 7 or 8 months of recovery and he'd be back before the 1-year cash-in window closed. To make matters worse, the injury was actually misdiagnosed. He actually had a hematoma instead of a torn tricep and in fact returned to the ring just 2 months later, making the briefcase switch even more hasty. During his reduced time away, Kennedy was moved to Raw in the annual draft, a move that was treated as a coup for the Red brand. In fact, on commentary, Jim Ross exclaimed that Raw had just hit the jackpot by landing the superstar. When one door closes, another one opens, and there did seem to be redemption in future for the unlucky egomaniac, in the form of a certain paternity storyline. WWE introduced an angle in which Vince McMahon unknowingly fathered another child, who just so happened to be someone on the company roster. All signs pointed to the cutthroat and self-aggrandizing Kennedy as the perfect choice to be the McBastard in question. In fact, veteran WWE writer Christopher DeJoseph claimed in a 2015 interview that Kennedy was the planned choice, but added, "I think Vince hated Kennedy. The crowd loved him and everyone there loved him, but he didn't want to go there. The ending of the story was taken away, and before you know it, it was Hornswoggle." The Hornswoggle fiasco is a story for another day, but yes, Kennedy was aced out of yet another potential career-making angle. Rumors abounded that Kennedy would have feuded with babyface Triple H over company shares and control, with Vince backing his legitimate son in the story, but nothing of the sort ever materialized. And it might have just been for the best. At the end of August, scant weeks before the revelation that Vinnie Mac had fathered a leprechaun, Kennedy was one of 10 wrestlers suspended for being clients of the Orlando-based Signature Pharmacy, which had been plying steroids and other drugs to athletes from various sports. Compounding Kennedy's suspension was his appearance on Fox News' Off the Record the prior month in the fallout of the Benoit murder-suicide. In commenting on the prevalence of steroids in wrestling, Kennedy defended WWE's drug policy and also claimed that he'd never taken steroids. Among Kennedy's statements, the wrestler said, "I think there was a steroid problem in wrestling at one time, but I don't think there is anymore." Meanwhile, the findings of the Signature Pharmacy raids noted that Kennedy had received shipments of testosterone and growth hormone between October 2006 and February 2007. Of all the suspended wrestlers, therefore, Kennedy came off looking the worst. In his first match back after his suspension, Kennedy lost to WWE champion John Cena on an episode of Raw. The match was notable for being the one in which Cena tore his pectoral muscle while performing a hip toss, resulting in the champ suddenly vacating the title after a whopping 380-day reign. Not to say that the injury was Kennedy's fault, but really, 2007 was just not the man's year. The next 8 months of Kennedy's run were mostly uneventful, outside of a feud with Shawn Michaels at the end of 2007, in which Michaels defeated him at Armageddon, and then Kennedy won a rematch on the Raw that aired New Year's Eve. After that though, Kennedy sort of drifted in and out whenever a heel with some modicum of credibility was needed for something. The bloom was explicitly off the rose by this point in time. A sudden babyface turn in the spring of 2008 didn't yield much for Kennedy, outside of a win over William Regal in a match where the loser got fired from Raw. The next month, Kennedy was drafted back over to SmackDown, but barely had a chance to build any steam. A month back on the show, Kennedy dislocated his shoulder during a house show match with Shelton Benjamin and missed over 9 months of action. Late in his convalescence in the spring of 2009, Kennedy was drafted back to Raw, but not during the draft's televised portion. Instead, his move was announced during the supplementary stage on the company's website, which is where most of the lower ceiling performers get shuffled around. 2 drafts prior, remember, Kennedy was the grand hammer at the end of the night, signaling the arrival of an ascending megastar. But here, he was only an afterthought. And not just that, but an afterthought with just one WWE match left. On the Memorial Day 2009 edition of Raw, Kennedy returned to the show as a babyface, taking part in that weird basketball-themed 10-man tag in the main event. During the match, Kennedy took down Randy Orton awkwardly with a back suplex, on the same shoulder that Orton seriously injured a year earlier. Orton apparently flipped out on Kennedy backstage, and days later, the news broke. Mr. Kennedy was fired from WWE after less than 4 years, injury time included, on the main roster. Kennedy later stated that Orton and Cena both went to McMahon to complain that he was unsafe in the ring. A report from Figure 4 Weekly claims that on Vince's flight with his closest staff following the tapings, McMahon cut a scathing promo or went on a rant about Kennedy. He talked about how he was reckless, still green as a worker, clueless when it came to business instincts, and a huge liability. Apparently, nobody in creative or talent relations was willing to say a word in his defense. The general consensus was that he was too frustrating to deal with, because whenever you came up with an idea for him, there was a good chance that it would be completely derailed within a few months due to injury or something else. Days after McMahon's reported tirade, John Laurinaitis called Kennedy to tell him he was being let go. At the start of 2010, Kennedy joined Impact Wrestling, where he enjoyed a 6-year run. Highlights included a forgotten gem of a cage match with Kurt Angle at the 2010 Lockdown, as well as 2 reigns as world champion. Unfortunately, it wasn't the same as it would have been had he unseated The Undertaker in grand fashion before a WWE audience, as was the original plan. There's a word that seems to astutely summarize Kennedy's WWE lifespan: unfortunate. As a character, Kennedy was loudly and unapologetically abrasive, which was a good thing. He provided a new voice at a time when WWE needed fresh thunder to break up the monotony. And at first, the company certainly had enough faith in him to put him on winning paths, only for the sure thing to inevitably hit landmine after landmine en route to these glories. Had it happened once, maybe that misfortune could have been more easily shaken. Instead, the frequency of those time-consuming disruptions, however out of his hands some of them may have been, made him less and less desirable to the company with each passing moment. It didn't take WWE long to fall in love with Mr. Kennedy as a potential star, but it took less time for misfortune to derail every grand plan that looked to benefit him. And once faith and patience were exhausted, the time that it took WWE to wash their hands of Kennedy was sadly quicker than the drop of a mic.